Venezuela's opposition parties are excited because the opposition candidate won the gubernatorial election in Barinas on Sunday. They're calling this a major breakthrough for democracy since Barinas is the home state of Hugo Chavez, and that state's governorship has consistently been held by members of the family since Hugo Chavez became president in 1998. They're saying that through the power of the vote, Chavismo fell in Barinas. This is all smoke and mirrors to distract the international community. In Venezuela's latest round of fraudulent regional elections, the opposition parties won a whopping 4 out of 24 governorships. 3 went to the Democratic Unity Roundtable, which is the bloc of parties to whom Juan Guaido belongs. But here's the kicker. 3 out of the top 4 parties in the Unity Roundtable got 1 governorship each. Cojedes for the Justice First Party, Zulia for the party A New Era, and Barinas for the Democratic Action Party. The one major opposition party not represented here is Juan Guaido's party, the Will of the People. The 4th opposition governorship was New Sparta, which went to the candidate for the party Neighborhood Force. Neighborhood Force is a group that splintered away from Justice First in 2021, and the regime's National Electoral Council approved this party's creation and appearance on the ballot in order to further weaken one of the big 4 opposition parties and dilute the number of offices they hold, from small-town mayoralties to state governorships. Also, this is the 2nd gubernatorial election that Barinas has had in the last 3 months. The opposition candidates won both of them. What's interesting to me is all the fighting and horse trading that's happened in the Maduro regime specifically for control of Barinas. And as of 2021, I consider the opposition parties to be part of the regime. As I said, this is the first time in 23 years that a member of the Chavez family isn't the governor of Barinas. The corruption within the ruling party was hilarious to see. 2 different Chavezes were competing in the primary for the PSUV's nomination. On the day of the primary, both of the Chavezes had their supporters and their paid entourages brawling at the polls. The dark comedy here is that neither of the 2 Chavezes cares about actually meaningfully governing the state. They're fighting over the pie. All the public funds and oil revenues that could be embezzled. It's nothing new. The Venezuelan government was a kleptocracy even before Chavismo came to power. And I think that the euphoria of hope for real change in 2019 made most of us forget that the opposition would be no exception. And it wasn't just in Barinas. Chavistas were brawling against Chavistas at the polls in the states of Merida, Guárico, Zulia, and multiple other states. All of them brawling over who should get to canvass voters at the polls, who should get to help the Electoral Council count the votes, wink wink, and whose candidate would appear on the general election ballot. In other words, who would get a piece of the pie. Because in Venezuela, political participation is a business now. And this was just the primaries. In the first gubernatorial election in Barinas back in November, Freddy Superlano of Juan Guaido's party won. Or should I say, was handed the victory temporarily because Maduro's regime are the ones who count the votes. There's a reason that the regime allowed Superlano to be the opposition candidate. After they tried to kill him early in 2019, Freddy fell in line to play ball under their rules. Since the Popular Will Party is a good old boys club, as are all of today's opposition parties, Superlano's job was to use his position as a parliamentarian in the interim government to lobby the US to take the heat off of Alex Saab, Maduro's top money launderer of drug money and blood money from the gold mines on indigenous lands. That's why Freddy wrote good conduct letters in 2019 on behalf of Saab and his businesses, saying that everything was done on the up and up. However, 3 weeks before the general election of 2021, Alex Saab was surprisingly, finally extradited to the United States and immediately put in a federal penitentiary awaiting trial. My theory is that Superlano had made a backroom deal with the regime where if he were to get Alex Saab off the hook, he would be given the governorship of Barinas. But Saab was extradited to the mainland US anyway, making one of Maduro's worst fears come true. So, The regime let him win his dramatic hairline victory in what was advertised as a close race, and then the Chavista Supreme Court nullified the election results and disqualified Superlano from public office on account of a criminal and/or corrupt past. The part about the criminal or corrupt past is, ironically, totally correct, but coming from the regime, it's the pot calling the kettle black, because the opposition, in their wildest dreams, could never have looted as much of the country's wealth as the Chavista leaders have. But the point is, the regime was humiliating Superlano. That's their style. It's not good enough for them to just win. They have to humiliate their opponents and demoralize their opponents' supporters. When the usurper Supreme Court canceled the election results and called for a redo on January 9th, the Chavista candidate Argenis Chavez, his ego sufficiently bruised that Maduro allowed him to be humiliated in his own backyard and the cradle of his family's revolution, called it quits and dropped out. He didn't want to play ball anymore. So Maduro scraped the bottom of the barrel of the Chavez family tree and dragged out Jorge Arreaza, ex-husband of one of Hugo Chavez's daughters, who's had just about every office in Maduro's cabinet except president. In the January redo, the regime's National Electoral Council allowed Arreaza to be beaten in a 14% landslide by the controlled opposition candidate. What could the regime have given to Jorge to make him agree to be the patsy and lose in public? We'll get to that in a minute. So, 3 out of the big 4 opposition parties got a token governorship, plus 1 splinter group, and the regime took the other 20. No governorships went to Juan Guaido's party, because they have to be humiliated. This is a piss-poor argument that elections under the regime's rules are the path to freedom in Venezuela. That line of thinking, which is purely propaganda being cruelly sold to the people as hope, encourages people to ignore the reality in front of them. Under the Chavista regime, opposition victories are merely symbolic. Wherever an opposition candidate has won a governorship or a mayoralty, Maduro has appointed a revolutionary protector. The protectors are warlords with a mix of civil, police, and paramilitary power, whose job is to be the counterweight to public office holders from the opposition. The regime even diverts funds originally meant for the governor's office and the state executive branch directly to the protector, thus further weakening the opposition governor. Here's an example of what protectors would do to save their revolution. In February of 2019, the protector of Tachira, Freddy Bernal, deployed paramilitary forces to violently and lethally repress protesters, and he activated the armed forces and Minister of Prisons Iris Varela to arm 3,000 prison convicts from El Dorado and Vista Hermosa prisons to suppress an indigenous uprising against the regime in the state of Bolivar. That's how much power these unelected warlords have in order to keep Maduro and their party in power.
Así que, camarada ministra, eternamente agradecido con usted por su valentía, por su esfuerzo, por ser leal al comandante Chávez y por verdaderamente ser una hija de Chávez. Y sabemos que también está nuestro protector del Táchira, el camarada Freddy Bernal, trabajando por él.
New Sparta, one of the 4 states handed to the opposition in 2021, already has a protector. So does the state of Zulia, where Maduro recently took jurisdiction over the state's highways and airports away from the governor's office and the state executive branch. And in his concession tweet for the governor's race, Jorge Arreaza made a cryptic statement that he and his party will protect Barinas from other spaces. Sounds to me like Barinas has a protector. There are even protectors of individual universities where the opposition holds power in the faculties and student governments. Having university protectors is a violation of Article 109 of the Constitution and a violation of Venezuela's law of universities, which establishes university autonomy. The Central University and Eastern University are among the latest institutions to be taken over by unelected regime warlords. More importantly, there's the inconvenient but glaring truth that Venezuela is a country militarily invaded by the Cuban armed forces and Cuba's Communist Party civilian militias, by Russian troops and contractors. Colombian Marxist guerrillas, Hezbollah guerrillas, and various armed groups of apolitical drug traffickers from Mexico and Colombia. Cuba literally has a military shadow government running Venezuela called the Cooperation and Liaison Group. There is no gubernatorial election, presidential election, or recall election in the world that will remove the Chavistas from power. Only more rebellion can overthrow Maduro, and only a war of national liberation led by the Venezuelan people and supported by international allies can remove all the armed invaders from the country. After this, the next card in the opposition's political playbook is to mobilize their old voting base for a recall election on Maduro to get people's hopes up. They already tried this in 2016, and the regime's National Electoral Council blocked the recall from happening. And when attempts to remove Maduro through a recall fail in 2022 or 23, the opposition will redirect their focus to what they really planned on doing all along: presidential elections with the regime in 2024. This was the plan that the big four opposition parties agreed to amongst themselves before they used their parliamentary majority to make Juan Guaido the interim president in January 2019. Assemblyman Guaido legitimately was the interim president in 2019, according to the Constitution, but he was still a puppet of the big four party leaders. Nowadays, Guaido is a pariah, hated by average Venezuelans who believed in him 3 years ago, and who risked their lives marching in his scripted political reality show, although we all thought it was real at the time. He's also toxic for opposition career politicians who need to run for office and raise campaign funds, or else they're simply out of a job. According to the Venezuelan data analytics firm Meganalysis, 64% of adult Venezuelans believe that both the ruling party and the opposition are extremely corrupt and that voting is a waste of time. 66% believe, as I do, that the opposition sold out to the regime and is now actively working for Maduro. So trust me, it's not helping the cause of freedom in Venezuela when James Story says that the US will continue supporting the opposition that Venezuelans now hate as much as they hate the ruling party. The opposition and their interim government had one job in 2019: evict Maduro, be a transitional government, and make free elections happen as soon as possible. Instead of doing this, opposition politicians looted as much aid money from the US and as much of Venezuela's public funds as were available to them as they possibly could, while their country went to hell around them. It's an insult to every Venezuelan who died protesting in the streets, or was murdered in his own home by Maduro's death squads. And what makes it worse is that the United States government continues supporting this kleptocracy with diplomatic recognition and with American tax dollars in the form of humanitarian aid and other monetary aid packages. The Venezuelan opposition does not exist to enact regime change in Venezuela or to fight for the freedom and the rights of their constituents. The opposition exists to help Maduro and the Cubans pretend that there's democracy in Venezuela. And as an American taxpayer, I can't help but wonder, why are we paying this garbage opposition to hand the country and the people over to the communists? Thank you for watching Venezuela Explained.